Daniel Boone continued to explore the Appalachian Mountains, always on the lookout for a path that might lead him to the other side. One day he was visited by an old friend, John Finley. As the two men talked, Daniel told John of his desire to find a way to cross the mountains. To his great surprise, Finley replied, "Why, I know a way. I've crossed the Appalachians myself." He told Daniel that he knew of several big gaps in the mountains. A gap is a space between two things. Formed by rushing water years ago, the natural gaps or passes through the mountains had been trampled down first by buffalo and later by Native Americans. Passes make it easier to cross mountains than climbing straight up to get to the other side. One pass was not too far from where Daniel Boone and his family lived. "It's in Virginia, and it's called the Cumberland Gap," Finley told him. "It is an old Native American footpath. You can only walk or ride a horse on a footpath." Boone was delighted. He asked John Finley to show him how to find it. Not long after that, the two men set off with 4 other men on a big adventure to find the Cumberland Gap. The Cumberland Gap is near Virginia's borders with Kentucky and Tennessee. They walked and rode on horseback for many miles before reaching the beaten path that led up a steep side of the mountain. They spent long days climbing up and up and up. Daniel's skills as a woodsman helped him identify animal tracks and follow the Native American footpath. They were overjoyed to reach the top of the mountains, where they could see a magnificent river stretching out beneath them. Following a narrow footpath, the men finally made it to the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, to the land that is now known as Kentucky. Kentucky is located to the west of the Appalachian Mountains, so Daniel Boone made it to the other side. Daniel and his friends were pleased with what they found on the other side of the mountains. The land was rich and fertile, and there were great herds of buffalo grazing on grasses. For the next 2 years, Daniel Boone stayed in eastern Kentucky, hunting and trapping wild animals. Daniel Boone used traps to catch animals. Boone used these animals for food and for their fur. When he finally returned to North Carolina, he was met by other settlers who expressed an interest in leaving their homes in the east and moving westward. These pioneers asked Daniel if he could show them the way across the Appalachian Mountains. A pioneer is one of the first people to live in a new place. "It's not an easy trip," Boone told them. "The forests are dense, and there are many dangers along the trail." But the pioneering spirit of these settlers remained strong. 2 years later, they convinced Daniel that they were serious about making the hard and dangerous trip to lands in the wilderness. The wilderness refers to an area of land with many wild plants and animals, and few people living there. Often there are few roads that go through the wilderness. And so Daniel led his own family, along with several other families, back through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky. However, the trip proved even harder for families than it had been for the woodsmen. The families were not used to living in the wild outdoors like the woodsmen. Setting up a settlement in Kentucky was more difficult than the pioneers expected, and they were forced to go back home over the Appalachian Mountains. Later, a businessman offered Daniel Boone a job to help widen some Native American trails that crossed the Appalachian Mountains. He wanted Daniel to make the trails wider and clearly marked so that pioneers would not lose their way as they crossed the mountains. Daniel Boone became known as a trailblazer. He helped to open up the way for pioneers to move west. Boone helped to widen the Native American trails, making it easier for people to make the journey to the other side of the Appalachians. Daniel Boone gathered together a group of men to help him clear the forest through the wilderness. Together, they worked through rain, snow, and mud. They used axes to chop down trees and bushes to widen the old Native American footpath so that the pioneers' wagons would fit. Remember, a footpath is only wide enough for walking or riding a horse. A footpath is not wide enough for wagons. They built log bridges across streams. Daniel Boone and the men successfully cleared a trail from eastern Virginia through the Cumberland Gap and into Kentucky. The trail was originally Native American footpaths called the Great Warrior's Path. Later it became known as the Wilderness Road. Pioneers from Virginia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania began to move along the Wilderness Road in great numbers. By the time that Kentucky was declared a state, less than 20 years after the trail was widened, more than 100,000 people had used the Wilderness Road. Daniel Boone's hard work was responsible for opening up the area known as the West to many pioneers. As more and more settlers streamed into the West, relationships with Native Americans who were already living there became even more strained. Native Americans and settlers wanted to live on the same land and sometimes fought about it. Daniel Boone's own family was the first pioneer family to settle in Kentucky. Daniel chose a spot near the Kentucky River to build a fort. It took several years to complete the fort. About as large as one city block, the fort sheltered log cabins and the people that lived in them. The fort was named Boonesboro after Daniel Boone, the man who built it. Life was difficult for the pioneers in the beginning, but people kept streaming across the mountains. In fact, so many people came that Daniel Boone felt his wilderness was being destroyed. It was no longer a wilderness land. He never gave up his love for the wilderness and continued to explore lands to the west of Kentucky until his death at the age of 86.